The Galactic Council thought we were jokes. They regret it. The Valorian Dominion had not lost a war in 11,000 years, and Prime Marshal Doric Vanthius intended to keep it that way with the same effort a man spends swatting a fly. His flagship, the Aurelian Ascendant, was 3 kilometers of layered adamantine hull, its spine studded with particle lances thick enough to core a moon, its belly lined with hangar bays that could vomit forth 10,000 fighters in under 6 minutes. It moved through the void like a cathedral built by gods who had forgotten what mercy was for, trailing behind it 400 warships arranged in the Dominion's ceremonial conqueror's lattice, a formation so old, so steeped in tradition that no enemy in recorded memory had ever survived long enough to see it fully deployed. It was not designed for war. It was designed for parades. That was the point. The Valorians had stopped needing to fight for real centuries ago. They had only needed to arrive. Vanthius stood on the command dais of the Ascendant with his hands folded behind his back, watching the tactical display bloom with the soft blue light of the system they were about to erase from the map of independent worlds. The system was called, in the clumsy human tongue, Kessler's Landing, a single rocky world orbiting a dim orange star, with a gas giant the size of a bruised continent hanging 2 light towers further out, and a scattering of orbital structures around the planet that his sensor officers had already classified as agricultural processing stations, communication relays, and one modest shipyard barely large enough to build a corvette. It was, by every metric the Dominion's intelligence corps had gathered, a backwater, a footnote, the kind of place you conquered on your way to somewhere that mattered so that the tribute ledgers would show one more world bent under Valorian law. Class 5 minimal threat, said Fleet Intelligence Director Seneska Rowe, reading from the tablet in her long, 6-fingered hand as she stood at Vanthius's side. Her voice carried the particular boredom of someone who had recited 1,000 identical reports about 1,000 identical worlds. Population approximately 4 million, no standing navy of consequence. Their most advanced warship on record is a light frigate with kinetic point defense and a single spinal railgun of laughable caliber. Their species, designated Homo sapiens, has no history of interstellar warfare prior to this century. Colonial charter filed with 3 separate merchant consortia, none of which maintain military obligations. Recommend Ultimatum Protocol 7, demand for immediate and unconditional surrender, with conventional bombardment authorized only if the demand is refused within the standard grace window. The Aurelian Ascendant's corridors, wide enough for 6 Valorians to march abreast in ceremonial formation, were lined with the trophies of those 412 conquests, banners stripped from the parliament halls of surrendered worlds, preserved atmospheric samples from planets whose native life had not survived the transition to Dominion tribute status, a long gallery of statuary depicting Vanthius himself accepting the capitulation of one alien delegation after another. Each sculpture slightly larger than the last, a quiet, unspoken record of a career that had never once required him to learn the taste of doubt. He had been raised from adolescence in the doctrine of the conqueror's certainty, the foundational Valorian military philosophy that held that war was, in its truest form, a psychological transaction rather than a physical one, that any species sufficiently intelligent to build starships was sufficiently intelligent to recognize overwhelming force when it arrived in orbit, and that the actual exchange of weapons fire was, 9 times in 10. An unnecessary formality reserved only for the terminally foolish or the terminally desperate. He had watched entire star systems fold without a shot fired, governors and kings and elected councils alike surrendering the moment the conqueror's lattice bloomed into view above their capital worlds, because the Dominion had spent 11,000 years cultivating a reputation so total, so unambiguous, that resistance had become, for most species unlucky enough to sit in its expansion path, simply unthinkable. They will surrender, Vanthius said, and it was not a question. He had conquered 412 worlds in his 300-year command tenure, and in that time he had learned that fear had a smell, a texture, a way of arriving in a system's communications traffic long before the first shot was ever fired. Kessler's Landing's traffic was full of it panicked civilian chatter, evacuation orders being drafted and rescinded, a colonial governor whose voice, when they finally intercepted a live transmission, cracked with the particular tremor of a man watching his entire world. The fate compressed into the next few hours. They always surrender. The only question is how much of their infrastructure survives the demonstration. He did not know, could not have known, that the tremor in colonial governor Amara Osai's voice was not fear. It was fury, carefully modulated, carefully performed. Because Amara Os had spent the last 4 years since the first Valorian scout drone was detected at the edge of the system, building the most elaborate lie in the history of human diplomacy. And she was not about to let 3 centuries of Valorian arrogance ruin the timing. Kessler's Landing was not what it appeared to be. It had never been what it appeared to be. The colony's official founding charter, filed with merchant consortia who did not exist beyond a few shell corporations and forged transaction logs, was a fiction constructed by the highest levels of Earth's Unified Defense Command the moment long-range surveys confirmed that the Valorian Dominion's sphere of expansion was going to intersect human space within 2 generations. Humanity, in the early days of its interstellar awakening, had made a discovery that terrified its own governments more than any external threat. They had looked out at the galaxy, cataloged in the Dominion's own diplomatic databases and those of a dozen client species desperate enough to sell intelligence for protection, and understood with total clarity that they were surrounded by empires who solved disagreements with orbital bombardment and measured their own greatness by the number of species they had ground beneath their boots. There was no diplomatic solution to a civilization that considered diplomacy a courtesy extended only to the already defeated. There was only preparation or extinction. So humanity had prepared, quietly, patiently, for 31 years while the surface of Kessler's Landing continued to look from orbit, from long-range scans, from every angle a lazy and overconfident empire cared to examine, like exactly the kind of unremarkable colonial backwater that great empires stepped over on their way to conquest. The agricultural processing stations in high orbit were nothing of the sort. Beneath heat-radiating shells engineered to mimic the thermal signature of grain silos and hydroponics, arrays sat coilgun cores 300 meters long, magnetically levitated barrels, capable of hurling superdense tungsten iridium slugs at 11% of the speed of light, kinetic energy releases that would register on Dominion sensors, in the instant before those sensors stopped registering anything at all, as small tactical nuclear detonations. The communication relay that Senaska Rowe's report dismissed with a single board line of text was in fact a distributed phased array combat computer, humanity's crowning achievement in the 3 decades since the scout drones had first been detected, an artificial tactical intelligence codenamed Atlas, built not to think like a human or even like the alien intelligences the Dominion had subjugated and enslaved into service, but to do one thing with monomaniacal perfection: coordinate the independent fire solutions of hundreds of weapons platforms and thousands of drones into a single, seamless, murderous symphony faster than any biological commander could blink. And the shipyard, the modest shipyard barely large enough to build a corvette, was a decoy so successful that its designers had won classified commendations for architecture nobody outside a 6-person committee would ever be allowed to know about. The real shipyards were 2 light towers away, tucked into the roiling amber cloud bands of the gas giant Kessler's watch, where the electromagnetic chaos of the giant's magnetosphere and a network of purpose-built sensor scattering arrays created a stealth environment so complete that a fleet of 340 human warships had been sitting in that soup of static and radiation for 6 years, running silent, running dark, waiting. They were not frigates. Senaska Rowe's report on humanity's most advanced warship was 3 years out of date and had been fed to Dominion intelligence deliberately, through a compromised merchant intermediary humanity had identified and turned into an unwitting asset years earlier. The ships waiting behind Kessler's watch were something else entirely. Long, low, matte black wedges of a design philosophy that had nothing to do with the cathedral aesthetics of Valorian shipbuilding and everything to do with a single design principle drilled into every naval engineer on Earth since the Dominion's expansion vector was first plotted. You cannot lose what the enemy cannot see, and you cannot survive what the enemy cannot dodge. The largest of them, the human flagship Ulysses S. Grant, was barely a kilometer long, a third the length of the Aurelian Ascendant, but her hull was wrapped in radar-absorbent composite that drank incoming sensor pulses instead of reflect. Ting them, her heat signature was bled off through a rear-mounted radiator fin that only unfolded in open space away from any enemy line of sight, and her spine carried not one grand cannon built for spectacle but 48 independently targeted railgun batteries, 12 nuclear-pumped X-ray laser pods that fired once and consumed themselves in the doing, and hangar space for 600 autonomous drones no larger than a human torso. Each one a hunter-killer built for a single suicidal engagement. Fleet Admiral Marcus Chen commanded that fleet from the Grant's armored command bridge, and unlike Vanthius, he did not stand with his hands folded behind his back radiating the serene confidence of inevitability. He sat forward-leaning, elbows on his knees, watching the same tactical display that Vanthius watched 2 light towers away, and he felt something colder and more useful than confidence. He felt certainty, the specific certainty of a man who has run the same simulation 4,000 times and knows, down to the percentage point, how badly this was about to go for the other side. "They're deploying the Conqueror's Lattice," said Commander Priya Anand, the Grant's tactical officer, her voice flat with the particular calm that comes from years of training to sound calm regardless of what her pulse was actually doing. 406 hulls confirmed. Lead elements are 3 cruisers of the Vashtu class screening for the flagship. Atlas estimates the flagship at approximately 3 kilometers, consistent with a Dominion Marshall-class command vessel. "Let them deploy it," Chen said. "It's a pretty formation for a parade. It's going to be a nightmare to break apart from the inside once the shooting starts because none of those 400 ships were designed to operate independently of that lattice. Their whole doctrine assumes uncontested space superiority from the first shot. They've never had to fight for it. That's about to become our biggest advantage." He looked up at Anand. "Confirm Atlas has full target lock priority on their command and sensor nodes." "Confirmed, Admiral. Atlas has already built a full engagement solution. It's had one for the last 4 hours since their lead scouts crossed the outer marker. It's just waiting on your word." Chen nodded slowly and allowed himself for just a moment to think about Amara Osai down on the surface, standing in a bunker 300 meters below Kessler's Landing's capital city with a script in front of her that she had rehearsed until she could deliver it in her sleep, preparing to buy the fleet the last few hours of positioning it needed with nothing but her voice and her nerve. He thought about the 4 million civilians who had spent the better part of 3 decades knowing, in the abstract, distant way people know about disasters that have not yet happened to them, that this day was coming, and who had drilled evacuation routes into underground shelters with the same grim dedication that their ancestors once drilled fire escapes. He thought about how strange it was that the entire fate of a species might come down to the next several hours, and how the Dominion, drifting toward them in their gleaming formation of unearned confidence, had no idea any of it was happening. "All ships final stealth confirmation," Chen said. "Nobody moves, nobody transmits, nobody so much as breathes loud until Atlas gives the mark. We only get to spring this trap once." 2 light towers away, oblivious to the 340 warships gathering silently in the storm-wrapped shadow of the gas giant behind him, Prime Marshal Vanthius opened a channel to the surface of Kessler's Landing and delivered, with the theatrical grandeur the Dominion reserved for moments it considered historically significant, an ultimatum he had delivered, in one phrasing or another, 412 times before. People of Kessler's Landing. His voice boomed across every frequency the colony's communications array could receive, translated instantly by the Dominion's linguistic algorithms into flawless, accentless English that somehow still managed to sound like it was sneering. I am Prime Marshal Doruk Vanthius of the Valorian Dominion, commander of the Third Conquest Fleet, and I speak to you now with the full authority of 11,000 years of unbroken Valorian sovereignty. Your world has been assessed, catalogued, and found suitable for incorporation into the Dominion's protectorate holdings. You will stand down all defensive installations, surrender all military and paramilitary assets, and prepare your governing authority for immediate transfer of sovereignty. In exchange for your compliance, the Dominion offers what it has always offered the wise: continuity. Your cities will stand. Your people will live. Your customs, so long as they do not interfere with tribute obligations, will be permitted to continue in whatever quaint form pleases you. Resistance, however, will not be tolerated and will not be survived. You have one standard hour to comply. In the underground bunker beneath the colonial capital, Governor Amara Os listened to the translation feed with her jaw tight and her hands folded on the desk in front of her. And then she opened her own channel and let just enough tremor into her voice to sound like a woman on the edge of panic, rather than a woman counting down the minutes on a countdown timer she had memorized to the second. Prime Marshal, this is Governor Amara Os of the Kessler's Landing Colonial Administration. Please, we need time. Our council needs to convene, our people need to be informed. We cannot simply the transfer of sovereignty, the legal frameworks. We have consortium obligations that require, she let her voice crack, just slightly in exactly the place her media coaches 3 decades ago had told her a genuinely frightened person's voice would crack. Please, we are not soldiers. We are farmers, engineers, families. Give us time to make this transition without panic. I beg you. Vanthius, listening to the translated plea from the command dais of the Aurelian Ascendant, felt the familiar, comfortable warmth of confirmed expectation. This was how it always went. The pleading, the stalling, the invocation of families and farmers, as if the Dominion had not heard those exact words in exactly that order from the leadership of 412 other worlds before their formal capitulation. He glanced at Seneska Rowe, who was already making a small, satisfied note on her tablet. The intelligence assessment validated yet again. The Class 5 minimal threat behaving precisely as a Class 5 minimal threat should. 3 hours, Vanthius said, magnanimous in the way that costs nothing when you believe total victory is already assured. Use them wisely, Governor. I would rather receive your surrender than your extinction, but I confess a certain professional indifference as to which. He did not know that every minute of those 3 hours was a gift the Atlas Combat Network had specifically requested, relayed to Osai through a communications loop so deeply encrypted and so carefully disguised as routine colonial administrative traffic that Dominion signals intelligence, confident and unbothered, did not so much as flag it for review. He did not know that in those 3 hours, the human fleet behind Kessler's watch completed its final targeting calibration against every one of the 406 Dominion warships now settling into high orbit, cross-referencing hull signatures, drive plume characteristics, and point defense coverage gaps with a thoroughness that would have made Sun Tzu weep with professional envy. He did not know that the agricultural processing stations, orbiting the planet directly beneath his fleet, had spent those 3 hours running silent diagnostic cycles on coilgun cores that had not fired an angry shot in 3 decades of construction and testing, confirming, one by one, that every single one of them was ready. He did know because his sensor officers reported it to him with the same bored efficiency they reported everything else, that Kessler's Landing's population centers were, as expected, initiating what looked like a full civil evacuation, citizens streaming into underground shelters, surface traffic patterns consistent with panic, exactly the kind of chaotic scrambling a Class 5 minimal threat civilization would produce in the face of overwhelming force. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile at the sensor readout, because it meant the coming bombardment, if it proved necessary, would at least kill fewer of them than it might have otherwise. And Doric Vanthius, whatever else could be said of him, did not consider himself a needlessly cruel man. He was simply a man who had never once needed to be anything other than overwhelming, and had therefore never developed the muscle for imagining what it might feel like to be surprised. The 3 hours ended. Amara Osai's final transmission arrived precisely on schedule, her voice steady now, resigned, the voice of a leader who has run out of options and knows it. Prime Marshal Vanthius, the Colonial Council of Kessler's Landing has convened. We cannot in good conscience order our people to die for a fight we cannot win. We accept the terms of the Dominion's protectorate. We surrender. A ripple of something that might have been satisfaction moved through the command deck of the Aurelian Ascendant. Senaska Rowe closed her tablet with a soft click. 413, she was already thinking, filing the number away for the historical record the Dominion kept of Vanthius's unbroken record of conquest. Wise, Vanthius said, prepare your governing council for immediate transfer protocols. I will be dispatching an occupation delegation to the surface within the hour to formalize. Marshal, the voice belonged to his Censor Chief Ordath Ven, and it carried a note that had not been present in any transmission on the Ascendant's bridge in longer than Vanthius could remember. Confusion. Marshal, I'm reading the orbital agricultural platforms. Their thermal signatures are shifting. All 3 of them simultaneously. It looks like, sir, it looks like reactor cores are spinning up to combat load levels. Vanthius turned, frowning, the first small crack of irritation appearing in his otherwise serene confidence. Explain. He never got the chance to hear the explanation, because at that exact moment, precisely 440 light seconds after the last coded syllable of Governor Osai's surrender transmission left Kessler's Landing's communications array, a delay engineered down to the second by Atlas to guarantee that every Dominion sensor operator, every tactical officer, every soul on every bridge across 406 ships would be caught in the specific fatal moment of relaxation that follows a confirmed capitulation. The sky over Kessler's Landing came apart. The 3 orbital platforms that Dominion intelligence had dismissed as agricultural processing stations shed their outer hulls in a single synchronized detonation of explosive bolts, revealing beneath the fiction 300-meter railgun barrels, each magnetic coils blazing incandescent white as 3 superdense tungsten iridium penetrator rods, each one massing 4 metric tons, were accelerated to 11% of light speed in less time than it took a human heart to beat. There was no warning flash visible from range, no drive plume to track, no missile trail to intercept, only 3 lines of ionized atmosphere briefly glowing in the platform's wake. And then, less than 2 seconds later, 3 of the Dominion's screening cruisers simply stopped existing. The Vashtu-class cruiser Ironhold Vigil, 400 meters of layered plating that had shrugged off asteroid impacts and pirate raids for 2 centuries of service, took a hit amidships that did not merely breach her hull. It converted the entire midsection of the ship into a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated plasma and shrapnel in a kinetic energy release equivalent to a small tactical nuclear warhead, because at those velocities, that was functionally what it was. Her sister ships Dawnbreaker's Wrath and Sovereign's Claim died in the same instant, in the same way their crews given no time to scream, no time to brace, no time to do anything but exist, and then, a fraction of a second later, not. On the bridge of the Aurelian Ascendant, the tactical display that had shown a calm blue system awaiting formal transfer of sovereignty erupted into a chaos of red alert icons and cascading damage reports, and Prime Marshal Doric Vanthius felt, for the first time in 300 years of unbroken military service, a sensation his body did not have a properly calibrated response for. The vertiginous, gut-dropping realization that the tactical picture he had trusted implicitly for his entire career was catastrophically, fatally wrong. "Report," he bellowed, and Ordath Ven, ashen, fingers flying across his console, could barely keep pace with the incoming data. Three cruisers destroyed Marshall, the platforms, the agricultural platforms, their railgun emplacements, heavy caliber. I don't have accurate range on their reload cycle, but Marshall, I'm reading additional weapons fire the shipyard facility. It's not a shipyard, sir. The mass and energy signatures are inconsistent with any known civilian. The modest shipyard that Senaska Rose intelligence report had assessed as barely large enough to build a corvette shed its own camouflage shell in the same instant, revealing not a shipyard at all but a fourth orbital railgun platform, larger than the first three, its central spine unfolding like some vast mechanical flower to reveal a coilgun assembly capable of firing not single penetrator rods but tight clusters of them, saturating a target area rather than a single point. Its first salvo tore through the heart of the Dominion's second cruiser screen, and where the first three platforms had killed three ships with 3 shots, this fourth platform killed 6 with 1. Its cluster of penetrators ripping through the packed formation of the Conqueror's lattice with the indifferent efficiency of a scythe through wheat. Vantheus stared at the display, at the sudden bloom of destroyed hull icons where moments ago there had been an orderly, ceremonial formation, and something in his 3 centuries of accumulated instinct screamed that this was not the improvised desperation of a cornered colony. This was a trap. A trap that had been prepared patiently, invisibly, for what must have been years, disguised beneath the most mundane possible cover, waiting for the exact moment his fleet would be closest, most densely packed, most thoroughly convinced of its own safety. All ships break formation, he roared, but even as the order left his mouth he understood, with the sick clarity of a man watching his own mistake compound in real time, that the order itself was the problem. The Conqueror's lattice was not simply a formation. It was a doctrine, a way of organizing command authority, sensor sharing, and point defense coverage that 400 years of Dominion naval tradition had baked into every officer's training from the moment they first stepped onto a bridge. Ships raised within that doctrine did not know how to fight independently. They knew how to fight as extensions of a lattice that assumed uncontested superiority, mutual sensor support, and centralized targeting authority flowing down from a command vessel that had never in living memory needed to issue orders faster than a leisurely, confident cadence. Breaking formation did not make his fleet more survivable. It made 400 ships, each individually competent but collectively conditioned into helplessness without their lattice, into 400 confused, isolated targets. That was when the second wave arrived, and this was the moment Fleet Admiral Marcus Chen would later tell his own officers, in the after-action briefing that would eventually be studied by every human naval academy for the next century, that the battle actually began, because everything before it had merely been the trap's jaws closing. Behind the gas giant Kessler's watch, 2 light towers from the slaughter now unfolding in high orbit, but linked to it by an Atlas-coordinated tactical network operating at the speed of light itself. 340 human warships that had sat silent and dark for 6 years finally lit their engines. For 6 years, those 340 ships had lived a strange and disciplined existence in the storm-wrapped dark behind Kessler's watch, their crews rotating through 18-month deployments in absolute communications silence, running reactors at the barest fraction of output needed to sustain life support and weapons readiness. Drilling combat scenarios against a simulated Dominion fleet that Atlas refined and re-refined, with every fresh scrap of intelligence, smuggled back from human intelligence assets embedded in a dozen border worlds. It was, by any measure, a punishing way to serve, and Fleet Admiral Chen had spent no small part of those 6 years personally reviewing the psychological evaluations of every crew member under his command, aware that the single greatest threat to the entire deception was not Dominion sensors, but simple human impatience. A bored gunner's crew testing an active sensor sweep out of restlessness. A captain deciding after 4 years of nothing that the whole elaborate scheme had been called off and it was safe to run active scans. It never happened. Whatever else could be said about the crews of the Hidden Fleet, they had understood down to the newest recruit exactly what was riding on their silence, and they had held it. They did not appear as a wall of light, the way the Dominion's own fleets always did when they surged from standby to combat readiness, engine plumes blazing in a proud, visible announcement of overwhelming force. They appeared instead as a spreading wave of near-nothing matte black hulls, whose engines were shielded and baffled to bleed heat only through narrow, directional radiator vanes pointed away from the enemy, whose drive signatures were deliberately staggered and randomized by Atlas to prevent any single sensor sweep from ever getting an accurate count. To the increasingly desperate sensor officers aboard the scattering ships of the Dominion fleet, the human fleet did not look like an approaching armada. It looked like sensor noise, gas giant radiation bleed, a smear of false positives that experienced operators had been trained for 3 centuries to filter out and ignore, right up until the moment those false positives opened fire. The first drone swarms launched from the human fleet's forward carriers arrived nearly 40 minutes before the capital ships themselves closed to engagement range. 600 autonomous hunter-killers per carrier, 12 carriers committed in that first wave, 7,200 individual drones spreading into a dispersed cloud that Atlas steered with a precision no biological pilot could match. Each drone was small, cheap, expendable by design, carrying a single high-yield shaped charge and just enough sensor and maneuvering capability to identify a target, commit to an attack vector and detonate on contact or near-miss proximity, individually insignificant but in aggregate, an inescapable storm of shrapnel and directed energy death that overwhelmed point defense systems built, like everything else in the Dominion fleet. On the doctrinal assumption that no enemy would ever field this many expendable threats at once, because no enemy the Dominion had fought in 11,000 years had ever had the industrial audacity to try. Point defense grids reporting saturation across 60% of the fleet, Ordeth then reported, his voice climbing toward panic despite his training. Marshal, we cannot intercept all of them. There are too many. They're not behaving like military drones. They're not maintaining formation discipline that are tracking algorithms. They don't need formation discipline, Vanthius snapped, understanding now far too late exactly what kind of enemy he had walked his fleet into. They're not meant to fight as a unit. They're meant to die as a mob and take a ship down with every 10th casualty. He had read once in some historical archive of pre-spaceflight human conflicts about a strategy called swarming, about insects that overwhelmed larger predators through sheer numerical persistence rather than individual lethality. He had dismissed it at the time as a historical curiosity irrelevant to modern warfare between species who had mastered orbital mechanics and directed energy weapons. He understood now, watching drone after drone slip through the gaps in his point defense coverage and detonate against hull plating, engine nacelles, and sensor arrays with methodical, Atlas-directed precision, that the humans had never stopped believing in it. They had simply scaled it up until it worked against anything. The Vashtu-class cruiser Dominion's Grace, one of the largest surviving vessels in the fleet's shattered second column, took 11 drone strikes in the span of 90 seconds, each one individually survivable, each one stripping away another layer of point defense capacity until the 12th strike. A drone that had patiently held position in her sensor shadow for nearly a full minute, waiting for Atlas's coordinating signal, drove directly into her exposed engine cluster and detonated. And the resulting cascade of fuel line ruptures and reactor containment failures turned her from a warship into a slowly tumbling wreck-venting atmosphere, and crew into the vacuum in the span of 11 seconds. The drones themselves were a marvel of ruthless economy that no Valorian shipwright, trained in a tradition that measured a weapon's worth by its individual grandeur, would ever have thought to build. Each hunter-killer measured barely 1.5 meters from nose to thruster, built from a compressed composite skeleton that human industrial planners had spent a decade optimizing down to the gram, its onboard intelligence limited to exactly the decisions it needed to make in the final 90 seconds of its existence. Identify the nearest viable target, calculate an approach vector that threaded whatever gap existed in that target's point-defense envelope, and commit. There was no pilot to mourn, no crew compartment to armor, no life support to maintain, only a shaped charge, a maneuvering thruster package, and just enough sensor fidelity to let Atlas's distributed targeting network steer 7,000 of them at once like a conductor's hand, moving through a symphony too fast for any single instrument to be heard alone. Dominion point defense doctrine, refined over centuries against missile salvos numbering in the dozens and fighter wings numbering in the hundreds, simply had no answer for an attacker that arrived by the thousands, and considered its own destruction an acceptable, even expected, outcome of a successful engagement. Every Dominion interceptor that found and destroyed a drone did so at the cost of a full second of tracking and firing solution time that could not then be spent on the next one. And Atlas understood, with an arithmetic clarity no Valorian tactician had ever needed to internalize, that a defense saturated past its processing threshold was a defense that had already functionally failed. Vantheus watched his fleet's point defense grids light up the tactical display in a frantic, strobing pattern of intercepts and misses, and understood that he was watching, in real time, the failure of a doctrine that had never once been tested against an opponent willing to spend that many small, expendable lives to buy a handful of critical hits. The escort cruiser Faith Unbroken, attempting to shield the flank of a heavier battlecruiser, exhausted her entire interceptor magazine in under 4 minutes and was reduced in the space of a single subsequent drone pass to a Hulk venting reactor coolant into the void. Her captain's last transmission a single garbled burst of static that never resolved into words anyone aboard the Ascendant could make out. And then, while the Dominion fleet's attention and point defense capacity were consumed entirely by the drone swarm, the human capital ships arrived, and the true weight of the trap made itself known. Fleet Admiral Chen watched the tactical display aboard the Ulysses S. Grant with the same forward-leaning stillness he had held since the engagement began, occasionally offering a quiet, clipped order that Commander Anand relayed through Atlas's distributed command network to 340 ships spread across a volume of space measured in millions of kilometers, all of them moving with a coordinated precision that made the entire fleet function less like an assembly of independent warships, and more like a single vast organism with 340 separate sets of railgun batteries. Railgun batteries, full salvo, target priority on remaining screening elements and any vessel showing intact point defense capacity, Chen said. We clear their escorts before we touch the flagship. I want that marshal watching his entire fleet die around him before we let him understand he's next. 48 independently targeted railgun batteries per ship, 340 ships, each battery capable of firing every 4 seconds once its magnetic coils had cycled. The mathematics of the resulting bombardment were, in the sterile language of Atlas's after-action report, sustained kinetic saturation exceeding historical precedent by several orders of magnitude. In human terms, it meant that for the next 11 minutes, the space around the Dominion fleet filled with a hail of hypersonic tungsten iridium penetrators arriving from a stealth fleet that most Dominion sensor operators still had not definitively located, each one carrying kinetic energy equivalent to a battlefield nuclear weapon, each one aimed with a fire control precision that made evasion nearly impossible because Atlas was not simply predicting where a target ship would be. It was cross-referencing that prediction against the specific maneuvering doctrine baked into 3 centuries of Dominion Naval Academy training, doctrine that every officer on every one of those 400 ships had learned identically, and therefore doctrine that made their evasive maneuvers, however desperate, achingly, fatally predictable. Ship after ship died in that 11-minute span, and the manner of their deaths told its own story to anyone watching the tactical feed with a trained eye. The heavy cruiser Endless Glory took a full railgun salvo across her port flank and broke into 3 pieces, her forward section continuing on its original vector for nearly a full minute before its own momentum carried it into the wreckage of another dying ship. The escort carrier Wingspan of Conquest, attempting to launch her own fighter complement in a desperate bid to establish some kind of counterscreen, was struck mid-launch by a coordinated three-ship railgun volley that Atlas had specifically timed to catch her hangar bay doors open, and the resulting internal detonation of fueled and armed fighters still sitting on her flight deck turned the entire ship into an expanding sphere of debris in under 4 seconds. The command cruiser Iron Testament, flagship of the Dominion's second cruiser wing, made the single most competent tactical decision of any Valorian vessel in the entire engagement, breaking hard away from the main body of the fleet in a bid to escape the kill zone entirely, and was hunted down 8 minutes later by a squadron of 12 human destroyers who had been specifically tasked by Atlas with picking off exactly this kind of independent breakaway. Because Atlas had run this exact scenario in simulation 4,000 times and knew, with mathematical certainty, that some percentage of Dominion captains would attempt exactly this maneuver, and had prepositioned assets to counter it before the battle had even begun. Prime Marshal Vanthius watched his fleet die in fragments across a tactical display that could barely keep pace with the rate of loss, and felt something he had genuinely, truthfully never felt before in 300 years of command. The specific paralyzing horror of realizing that every single doctrine, every single tactic, every single piece of tradition his entire species' military culture had built across 11,000 years of unbroken conquest was not merely inadequate to this fight. It was actively working against him. The Conqueror's lattice that had cowed 412 worlds into submission through sheer visual intimidation was, in this engagement, nothing more than a densely packed target array that made Atlas's fire control calculations easier. The centralized command structure that had allowed Vanthius to personally direct every major engagement of his career with unquestioned authority was now a catastrophic bottleneck, because every order had to route through him, and he could not process battlefield information fast enough to issue orders at the tempo this enemy was fighting at. The Dominion's entire philosophy of war overwhelming force presented so completely and so visibly that resistance was rendered psychologically unthinkable before the first shot was even fired, depended entirely on the enemy being able to see what they were facing. And this enemy had spent 31 years making sure the Damen. Iron could not. Marshal, Senaskaro's voice when it finally came had lost every trace of its earlier bored confidence. It was small, and it was afraid, and it was asking a question she already knew the answer to. The intelligence assessment, Class 5 minimal threat, how did this happen? Vanthius did not answer her immediately, because he was watching on the tactical display the final destruction of the Third Conquest Fleet's entire forward screen, not the ragged, uneven attrition of a hard-fought battle, but the clean, methodical dismantling of a military force by an opponent who had never once been forced to improvise, because every single element of the engagement had been planned, rehearsed, and simulated years in advance. He watched the human capital ships, now visible on sensors as they closed the final range to what remained of his fleet, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man finally seeing an opponent's full hand after betting everything on a bluff that had already failed, exactly what those ships were. They did not look like warships in any sense the Dominion recognized. There was no grandeur to them, no ornamentation, no visible declaration of martial pride in their design. They were flat, angular, matte black wedges that seemed to actively resist being looked at, their hulls broken up by strange faceted panels that Vanthius's sensor officers. In the brief windows they had to analyze anything beyond the immediate crisis of their own survival. Identified as radar-absorbent composite plating, engineered specifically to defeat the exact detection methods Dominion sensor arrays had used, unchanged, for the last 6 centuries. They carried no visible weapon emplacements of the scale the Dominion favored, no massive spinal lances, no grand ceremonial batteries. Because their weapons were distributed, redundant, individually unremarkable, and collectively overwhelming. A philosophy of warfare built not around a single devastating strike, but around 1,000 small, coordinated, inescapable ones. And then the nuclear-pumped lasers fired. And Vanthius understood that even the railguns and the drone swarms had merely been the opening movements of a much larger and more terrible composition. The technology was, in principle, something the Dominion itself had experimented with centuries earlier and abandoned as impractical. A compact fission device, detonated in a contained chamber, its energy output captured in the microsecond before the device destroyed itself, and channeled through a series of lasing rods to produce a single devastatingly powerful pulse of coherent X-ray radiation, fired in the instant before the entire mechanism vaporized in its own detonation. The Dominion had abandoned the approach because it was wasteful. Each shot consumed an entire fission core, meaning every laser strike cost as much in raw material and engineering effort as building a small missile. And the Dominion's philosophy of overwhelming, sustained bombardment had never valued single devastating shots over the steady grinding attrition of massed conventional weapons. Humanity, watching from the outside with none of the Dominion's institutional confidence to protect and no interest in doing things the way they had always been done, had looked at the same technology and asked a different question. What if you did not need sustained fire? Because you only needed to punch through the specific point of a specific ship's armor that mattered exactly once at exactly the right moment. 12 pods per human capital ship, 340 ships. Chen had ordered them held in reserve for the entire opening phase of the battle, saving them for the moment the Dominion's largest remaining vessels, the true capital ships, the heavy cruisers and battle carriers that had thus far survived the drone swarms and railgun bombardment through sheer armored bulk, finally came within effective range. When that moment arrived, Atlas coordinated a single synchronized volley from every laser pod across the fleet, each one aimed not at a general target area, but at a specific individually calculated weak point on a specific ship's hull. Derived from 6 years of painstaking sensor analysis of Dominion ship construction that human intelligence had gathered from captured wreckage, defector testimony, and a level of patient technical study that the Dominion, in its confidence, had never imagined its primitive enemies capable of. The heavy battle carrier Eternal Dominion's might, second in size only to Vanthius's own flagship, took a single X-ray laser pulsed directly through a reactor coolant conduit that human intelligence had identified as a structural weakness common to every ship of her class, a flaw the Dominion itself had known about for 2 centuries and never bothered to correct, because no enemy in 11,000 years had ever possessed the sensor precision or the patience to find it and exploit it. The resulting coolant breach cascaded into a full reactor containment failure in under 30 seconds, and the Eternal Dominion's might, a ship that had participated in the conquest of 11 worlds across 4 centuries of service, vanished in a flash of light bright enough to be visible from the surface of Kessler's Landing, 4 light minutes away. The synchronized volley did not stop with the Eternal Dominion's might. Ship after ship along the Dominion's remaining heavy line took a single precise laser strike in the same coordinated instant, and the tactical display aboard the Ascendant bloomed with a horrifying uniformity of destruction that no random pattern of battle damage could have produced. The battle cruiser Endless Vigilance struck through a fuel bunker weak point, identified from a defector's schematic 3 years earlier. The heavy escort Unbending while taking a pulse directly through her bridge blister, in a strike so precisely placed that her entire command crew died in the same instant, without a single subordinate compartment reporting so much as a hull breach. The troop transport Harvest of Glory, carrying nearly 6,000 ground occupation soldiers who would never now set foot on Kessler's Landing soil, torn open along a structural seam Atlas had flagged as the single most efficient point of failure across the entire class. It was not battle damage in any sense the Dominion's tactical academies had ever taught their officers to expect. It was surgery performed at a range of hundreds of thousands of kilometers, by an intelligence that had spent years studying exactly where to cut. By the time the last echoes of that detonation faded from the tactical sensors, the third conquest fleet of the Valorian Dominion, 406 ships strong at the start of the engagement, numbered 131 hulls, scattered, leaderless in any functional tactical sense, and surrounded on every vector by a human fleet that had not lost a single capital ship in the entire engagement. Prime Marshal Doric Vanthius stood on the command dais of the Aurelian Ascendant, still intact, still the largest ship in the system, protected by layers of armor and point defense that had so far kept her alive where lesser ships had died, and felt the full, crushing weight of a realization that no amount of tradition, rank, or accumulated confidence could soften. He had walked 400 warships and 40,000 Valorian lives into an ambush prepared by a species his own intelligence core had assessed, with total confidence, as a joke. And the trap was not yet finished closing. Marshal, this time it was his weapons officer, Krellin Das, and his voice carried a new note that Vanthius had not heard from any of his bridge crew in the entire engagement. Something that was not quite hope but was reaching for it, grasping at any thread of tactical advantage that might still exist. The Ascendant's primary batteries are still at full capacity. We have not yet fired the spinal lance. If we can close range to their flagship and land a single direct hit, their command coordination. Their command coordination is not centralized the way ours is, Vanthius said quietly, and it was the first time in the entire battle that his voice had lost its edge of command authority and taken on something closer to grim, exhausted honesty. You have seen how they fight. Every ship acting with perfect coordination, no delay, no confusion, responding to threats faster than any single commander could issue orders to that many vessels. There is no flagship to kill, Das. There is only a machine mind directing all of it, and that machine mind is not aboard a single ship we can target. It is everywhere at once. He had realized this nearly 4 minutes earlier, watching the tactical display, watching 340 ships move and fire with a synchronization that no biological command structure, however brilliant, could replicate at that speed and scale. The humans had not simply outfought him. They had built a mind for war and let it do the fighting, freeing their human commanders to make the larger strategic decisions while the machine handled the impossible arithmetic of coordinating a fleet-scale engagement in real time. It was, Vanthius understood with the clarity that comes only from absolute defeat, exactly the kind of asymmetric advantage that a species smart enough to disguise 31 years of military preparation as agricultural infrastructure would think to build. Aboard the Ulysses S. Grant, Fleet Admiral Chen watched the same tactical display and made the decision that would define the final act of the engagement. Cease offensive fire on all remaining Dominion vessels, he said. Full defensive posture, maintain firing solutions but hold. Commander Anand, open a channel to their flagship. Let's see if their marshal is capable of learning something today. The channel opened, and for the first time in the engagement, Vanthius found himself looking not at a tactical display full of red icons denoting destroyed ships, but at the face of the enemy who had destroyed them. A human man, dark-haired, unremarkable in the way that ordinary competence often looks unremarkable next to the practiced grandeur of Dominion command culture. Sitting forward in a chair on a bridge that showed none of the cathedral opulence of the Ascendant's command dais. Surrounded by officers who looked exhausted but not remotely afraid. Prime Marshal Vanthius, Chen said, and his tone carried no triumph, no cruelty, nothing but the flat, professional finality of a man closing out a piece of unpleasant but necessary business. I'm Fleet Admiral Marcus Chen, Unified Human Defense Forces. You have 131 ships remaining. I have 340, all of them at full combat capacity, all of them with a clean firing solution on every vessel you have left. Your point defense grids are saturated, your drone screens have burned through most of their reserve, and I have 28 nuclear-pumped laser pods still charged and ready across this fleet, more than enough to finish what we started. I am not interested in destroying your remaining crews. I am interested in ending this engagement. You have 5 minutes to order a full stand-down and surrender, or I resume fire on every ship in your fleet, starting with the largest." In the brief silence before he answered, Vanthius found his mind drifting, unbidden, to the gallery of statues lining the Ascendant's central corridor, to his own stone likeness rendered 412 times in the act of accepting a lesser species' surrender, and he understood with sudden, unwelcome vividness that somewhere in the archives of this small, patient, unassuming colony, there would now exist a record of the reverse, not a statue perhaps. Humans did not seem given to that particular vanity, but a record all the same, a permanent line in whatever histories this species kept, marking the day the Valorian Dominion had been made to kneel by a world it had never bothered to properly look at. It was, he thought with a bitterness that surprised him with its intensity, the single most expensive intelligence failure in the recorded history of his species, and he understood already that his own career, whatever judgment the Dominion's ruling council eventually rendered upon it, would be remembered chiefly as the answer to a question nobody in his government had thought worth asking until it was far too late to matter. What happens when the overwhelming force arrives, and the other side was never afraid of it in the first place? Vanthius stared at the screen for a long moment. 300 years of unbroken Valorian military tradition warring against the plain, undeniable mathematics of the tactical display in front of him. Every instinct honed across 3 centuries of successful conquest screamed at him to refuse, to fight to the last ship, to preserve some fragment of Dominion honor even in total defeat. Because the Dominion did not surrender, had never surrendered, considered surrender a category of behavior appropriate only for the lesser species it conquered. But he was, whatever else his failures on this day, not a stupid man, and he understood that the difference between 300 years of tradition and 40,000 lives that were, at this exact moment, still salvageable, was not actually a difficult calculation once you stripped away the pride that made it feel difficult. "Senaska," he said quietly, not looking away from the screen. "Log for the historical record. Effective immediately, on my authority as Prime Marshal of the 3rd Conquest Fleet, I am ordering a full and unconditional stand-down of all remaining Dominion forces in this system." He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, something in his bearing had changed permanently, the serene confidence of a man who had never needed to imagine defeat replaced by the hard-won, humbling understanding of a man who now had. "Admiral Chen, the 3rd Conquest Fleet stands down. I am ordering all remaining vessels to power down offensive systems and hold position for whatever terms you intend to impose." "Good," Chen said, and there was no gloating in it, no cruelty, only the exhausted relief of a commander who had just avoided spending more of his own crew's lives than the engagement strictly required. Because unlike the enemy he had just defeated, Chen had never needed to prove a point through unnecessary destruction. "Terms are simple, Marshal. Your surviving fleet remains in this system under human supervision until a full accounting of your crew's welfare and your ship's status is completed. Your government will be informed, through whatever diplomatic channel you consider appropriate, that Kessler's Landing is not, and has never been, a colony available for conquest, and that any FUT. Your incursion into human space will be met with the same result you have just experienced today, at whatever scale is necessary. You are, as of this moment, a defeated commander in a warrior empire did not know it was fighting until it had already lost. I would suggest you use whatever remains of your journey home to think carefully about what your intelligence services got wrong about us, because I promise you, Marshal, we know exactly what we are. The only mistake here was made by people who assumed they already knew, without bothering to look closely enough to find out." The channel closed, and on the bridge of the Aurelian Ascendant, in the ringing silence that followed, Senaska Rose set down her tablet. The tablet that had 3 hours earlier confidently logged Kessler's Landing's population as a Class 5 minimal threat, and did not pick it up again for a long time because she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only from watching an entire framework of assumptions collapse in real time, that the report she had filed would need to be rewritten from its very first sentence. and that no rewriting of it would ever fully capture how completely, how catastrophically, the Dominion had misjudged the quiet, patient, unassuming species it had once dismissed as a joke. Fleet Admiral Chen, for his part, would spend that same 6-week withdrawal period doing something no Dominion commander in 11,000 years had ever needed to consider doing after a victory. Writing personal letters to the families of the small number of human crew who had been wounded during the engagement, and quietly ordering a full audit of Atlas's targeting decisions to confirm that the surrendered Dominion crews had been treated, in every particular, exactly as the laws of war his own government had ratified decades earlier required. It was, in its own understated way, as much a part of the message as the battle itself had been. Word of the engagement at Kessler's Landing reached the wider galaxy in the way such things always eventually do. First as rumor, passed between merchant crews and border patrol officers who had heard fragments of encrypted Dominion traffic they weren't supposed to intercept. Then as increasingly confirmed reports, as the scale of the defeat became impossible for even the Dominion's formidable propaganda apparatus to fully suppress. And finally, months later, as a formal matter recorded in the archives of the Galactic Council, the loose confederation of independent species who had spent centuries living in the uneasy shadow of Valorian expansion, and had never once, in living memory, seen that expansion meaningfully checked. The Council had classified humanity, on the strength of exactly the same intelligence the Dominion itself had relied on, as a curiosity, a young, isolated species with promising technology but no meaningful military tradition, unlikely to matter to galactic affairs for at least another century. That classification, too, would need to be rewritten. What the wider galaxy eventually came to understand, piecing the story together from salvaged sensor logs, defector accounts, and the eventual grudging release of an official Dominion after-action report that stripped Prime Marshal Vanthius of his command but could not strip away the plain facts of what had happened, was not simply that humanity had won a single battle through clever deception. It was that an entire species, faced with the near-certain knowledge that a vastly superior empire intended eventually to erase their independence, had chosen not to panic, not to beg, not to throw themselves on the mercy of a council too cautious to intervene on their behalf, but to spend 31 years quietly, patiently, without fanfare or announcement, building exactly the kind of trap that only a species with nothing to prove and everything to lose could have the discipline to build. They had disguised their most powerful weapons as grain silos. They had hidden an entire battle fleet behind a gas giant for 6 years without a single leak, a single defector, a single moment of impatience breaking the silence. They had led an empire that had never lost a war walk directly into the one fight in 11,000 years it could not win, and they had done it not through superior numbers, not through superior individual ship strength, but through patience, precision, and the quiet, unglamorous work of understanding an enemy more completely than that enemy had ever bothered to understand them. The formal surrender ceremony, if it could even be called that, bore none of the theatrical weight the Dominion had always attached to such moments in its own conquests. There was no delegation sent down to the surface in gilded shuttles, no ceremonial exchange of sovereignty documents witnessed by a crowd assembled for the occasion, no grand unveiling of a Valorian banner being lowered while a human one rose in its place. Instead, over the fall, Lowing Day's human tendercraft moved quietly among the wreckage and the surviving hulls of the Third Conquest Fleet, cataloging the dead, offering medical assistance to the wounded crews still trapped aboard damaged vessels, and overseeing the orderly transfer of weapons systems into a dormant, verified state that satisfied both sides' concerns without requiring either to trust the other's word alone. Vanthius found himself, in an irony he did not fail to appreciate, grateful for the plain, businesslike manner in which the humans conducted the entire process. There was no gloating in it, no performance of triumph designed to humiliate a defeated enemy for the benefit of some future historical record. only the quiet, competent handling of a difficult situation by people who seemed entirely uninterested in making it more difficult than it needed to be. It was, he thought, its own kind of message, perhaps more unsettling than any triumphant parade could have been. A species that did not need to perform its victory because it had never doubted from the very first railgun shot exactly how the engagement was going to end. Senaska Rose spent the long transit home compiling what would eventually become the most heavily redacted intelligence document in modern Dominion history, an exhaustive accounting of every assumption her original assessment had gotten wrong. And she found, as she worked, that the deepest failure was not any single missed detail, but a whole category of thinking the Dominion's intelligence culture had never developed the instinct to question. They had measured humanity by the yardstick of every other species they had ever conquered, assuming that a young civilization with limited visible military infrastructure must, by definition, be a weak one, never once accounting for the possibility that a species could look weak specifically, because it had chosen to patiently, deliberately, for longer than most Dominion officers had been alive. On Kessler's Landing itself, in the weeks that followed, the underground bunkers that had sheltered 4 million civilians through the tensest hours of their lives slowly emptied back into the daylight, and Governor Amara Osai stood on the surface of her world, looking up at a sky that no longer held the shadow of an invading fleet, and allowed herself, for the first time in 4 years, to simply breathe. Fleet Admiral Chen's ships remained in orbit for another 6 weeks, overseeing the orderly withdrawal of the shattered remnant of the Third Conquest Fleet and the careful, methodical work of recovering what could be recovered from the wreckage of ships that would never fly again. And far across the galaxy, in the sealed chambers where the Valorian Dominion's ruling council convened to discuss a defeat they would have preferred never to acknowledge at all, a single grudging conclusion began slowly to take hold: that the era of assuming the galaxy's newest and smallest civilizations were automatically its weakest ones was, whether the Dominion liked it or not, over. Humanity had not announced itself to the galaxy with a declaration, a treaty, or a plea for recognition. It had announced itself with a trap 31 years in the making, sprung in less than an hour, and the echo of that announcement would follow the Valorian Dominion and every other empire watching from a cautious distance, for a very long time to come.